My name is Jacob Miller. I'm the curator for the Historical and Genealogical Society of Somerset County, and we're here at the permanent exhibit at the Somerset Historical Center called Patterns on the Land. In our exhibit, we talk about the history of the rural area of southwestern Pennsylvania, and that includes a large farming history. The first farmers in our area were the Monongahela people, who lived here until about 1625. When they left the area, we don't know why, we don't know what happened, but we are only left with the archaeological evidence that they lived and farmed in this area of southwestern Pennsylvania. What you see here is a reproduction or a model of what we believe their houses looked like. The Monongahela lived in round bark-covered houses made of bent saplings. This scale model is based on archaeological evidence that we found in a site in Somerset County called the Nagy site that was excavated in the early 1970s. These houses were constructed using locally sourced wooden saplings that were bent to form a dome, which was then covered over by bark stripped off of trees from the area. These houses included living quarters, sleeping quarters, and also storage for their food and things that they grew and foraged for to carry them through the winter months. Because there was no documented contact with the Monongahela people, what we know about their life is based off of archaeological evidence that we've recovered from several sites in Somerset County. Things like pieces of pottery, some stone tools, and bits of charred seeds and corn that were recovered from their fire pits where they were cooking. Following the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768, this area of western Pennsylvania and Somerset County was open to settlement from the east to European settlers. This provided an opportunity for families to carve farmland and make homesteads in this area of Pennsylvania. Settlers were traveling on crude footpaths, carrying most of their possessions on their backs or on the pack horses or pack animals like oxen. And they were coming here to settle new farmland in the vast, endless forest of western Pennsylvania. When the settlers first arrived here, one of their first tasks was to start clearing the land and to put up some sort of shelter or structure for themselves. Oftentimes this was a log cabin. You can see an example here of the construction style. Using smaller timbers and a round notch, they would erect small square or rectangle cabins. These were crude shelters. They were very dirty, earthen floor, limited light inside. So eventually their goal was to put a more permanent structure like the log house. This is using squared off hewn timbers with a more sturdy V-notch joining system at the corners. As they cleared the land, farmers began planting crops such as buckwheat, oats, and raising hay to feed their livestock and to provide subsistence for themselves and products that they could then trade for other goods that they needed. Using horse-drawn or animal-drawn equipment like the plow, they tilled the land and were able to plant the crops that they needed. Before factory-made cloth was available, farmers in the northern regions of the United States commonly raised sheep and grew flax to clothe their families. Once the flax was harvested, they would remove the seeds, let it lay in the wet field to ret, and then dry it and break it. This object is known as the flax break. This allowed them to break up the outer hard husk of the flax plant to get to the fine inner fibers that would make up the linen thread and cloth. Once the flax was broken, the fibers were put through a heckle, which combed the fibers and aligned them together. The longer fibers were kept to make their fine material, and they were The fibers were spun into thread using a flax wheel or a spinning wheel. It was then wound onto a yarn winder, which allowed them to measure out specific lengths of thread. As the yarn winder goes around, a click would designate so many feet that had been wound onto the yarn winder. This German style loom was built sometime around 1777 to be able to complete the task of weaving flax and wool into cloth. In the early 1800s, manufacturers began to replace wooden plows and tools with iron tools that lasted longer. Mass production allowed those tools to be made available cheaper to farmers. These new tools allowed farmers to produce more food efficiently for the growing number of people who no longer farmed for themselves, like townspeople, traders, miners, and factory workers. What you're looking at is a fanning mill. This was produced by the Curator company in Somerset County, and it was a tool to separate the grain from the chaff and other particles that you didn't want. It operated by turning the hand crank on the left side, pouring the grain from the top. The fan inside, turned by the hand crank, would blow the lighter straw and chaff out of the end of the fanning mill. The heavier grain would fall to the bottom and would be collected. The late 19th century brought about enormous advances in farming equipment. Things like this threshing machine and steam engine made by the Frick Company in Waynesboro, Pennsylvania. These machines were expensive and required a lot of labor to be able to keep up with them. So many farmers of this area would pool their resources and use this equipment on many farms throughout the area to quickly process each farmer's crop for that year. Somerset County is the leading maple producing county in the state of Pennsylvania. To make maple products, you need to tap the maple tree by drilling a hole into it and letting the sap of the tree come out. To collect the sap, maple producers put wooden keelers or metal keelers or sap buckets on the tree to collect the sap. Once that keeler is full, usually about once a day during maple season, the keeler is emptied into a hauling tank and taken back to a building called a sugar camp. This is where they boil the sap to evaporate the water and concentrate it into maple sugar. It takes about 40 to 50 gallons of sap to make 1 gallon of maple syrup. Some early producers would further process that syrup into crumb sugar. This involves boiling the syrup till it reaches about 245 degrees Fahrenheit and then stirring it in a wooden trough until it crystallizes and forms a powder. Oftentimes the maple syrup is stored and shipped in tin containers that you see here from the L.E. Fraser Camp in Central City, Somerset County. By the 1940s, Somerset County farmers started to exclusively specialize in dairy farming. This was brought about by a higher demand for milk in more urban areas, and it was brought about by the access to cheap electricity, which allowed them to efficiently run their milking machines and other tools required to produce milk in the larger dairy herds that they would keep. Our exhibit features several tools used in the milking process, such as the milking machine, milk cans and product carriers, and the cream separator. Thank you for joining us on our tour of Patterns on the Land, our exhibit here at the Somerset Historical Center. We are open year-round, Wednesday through Saturday, 10 to 4. And for more information, please visit somersethistoricalcenter.org and check us out on our social media channels.